Sometimes we focus almost exclusively on one branch of a family. This film is a reminder that we have Danish roots and that we each are a part of the Isaacson story.
I am Peter Isaacson. I was born May 30th, 1828, at Sønderho, Thisted County, Denmark.
3 centuries earlier, Peter's family had lived in Copenhagen and were wealthy and powerful. This is what is left of the old Vordingborg Castle, built in 1360, where Peter's ancestor, Ejler Jacobsen, was a castle official. Ejler Jacobsen was so esteemed that he was depicted in this painting nearest the Savior. The painting hangs in Vordingborg Church in Vordingborg. Another direct line grandfather, Jacob Madsen, established Borsen, the Danish stock exchange, in the 1500s. The beautifully designed Borsen building is still in use today. Ejler Jacobsen Brun inherited a plantation in northwest Jutland. Peter was born there at home in a large, comfortable bedroom, the ceiling supported by heavy exposed beams.
I was 12 years old when my father died. I worked for 8 years as an apprentice to master the skills of carpentry and worked in that trade until I left my native land. Military service was required of all young men in Denmark, and I served 2 years fighting in the war between my country and Germany. Later, my brother lost his life in another war.
I am Martha Christina Clemensen. I was born May 7th, 1822, in Jægene, Thisted County, Denmark. I changed my name to Martha when I came to America. My father was a fisherman. We lived on a small island along the coast and we were very poor. My father died when I was only 9 years old, leaving my mother with 6 small children to feed. My mother was unable to provide for all her children, so she had to let the older ones go out to work. Papers were signed for a 7-year contract, and I went to work for a wealthy landowner on another island. I would never live at home again until after I was grown. You might worry about going without things today, but you never had to give up your children because you couldn't feed them. Along with board and room and wages of $8 a year in cash, I received the wool from 2 sheep every year to use for clothing, and I cleaned and carded, spun and knit all the wool myself. My mother was required to furnish me 1 pair of wooden shoes a year. The shoes were very comfortable and warm, and kept my feet from getting cold and wet. I was one of many servants on the big farm. My first job was to tend the ducks and geese. The large flock had to be carefully managed because there was such a demand for feathers in making bedding. In Denmark, we always slept on feather beds, or dun as we called them. We used feathers in the pillows and comforters too. As soon as I was old enough, I went into the fields to bind grain. All day long I followed the reapers and bound grain by hand. Before and after going to the fields to work, the women of the farm had extra duties. They were assigned to milk the cows, fix the meals, do the housework, and look after the butter and cream. I was never idle. I learned to stay up at night and knit all my sweaters and stockings in bed to keep warm, in the dark to save candles. Each indentured servant was required by law to keep a record book of their work history. The landowner would write down notations of job performance. The man I worked for was cruel. To keep his workers, he wouldn't write anything positive in the record books, as no one would hire a person without good references. I was glad when Mette, my younger sister, came to work on the same farm. We had been very lonesome for each other. Even though Mette was 17 years old, she was not very strong. I helped with as much of my sister's work as I could after I finished my own duties. When the wheat was ready, each man used a long-handled scythe to harvest. The women followed the men and bound the grain into sheaves. One day, Mette had an extra hard time keeping up. She kept getting farther and farther behind until she was a whole row behind the cutter. When the man who was cutting came near Mette again in the next row, he started teasing, seeing how close he could swing the sharp scythe. Each time he would cut a little closer to her. Then he slipped, and the blade of the scythe cut Mette deeply across the thigh. Her blood flowed uncontrollably. She bled to death before anything could be done. I felt so helpless as I watched my little sister die. This was the greatest sorrow of my life. Even as an old woman, I never ceased to grieve for my sister, whose death seemed so unnecessary and cruel. I continued working for the harsh landowner and with the man responsible for the death of my sister until the missionaries came to Denmark. I believed the missionaries' message and was ready to join the church. My mother was also baptized, as were a brother and a sister. I returned home and the family got ready to sail to America. My mother felt sad to be leaving part of the family behind, but she had a strong testimony of the gospel and knew those willing to gather to Zion would find a better way of life.
When I met the LDS missionaries, I accepted their message, even though the missionaries spoke no Danish and I spoke no English. Our common language was that of the Spirit. I served for a few months as a missionary to my fellow countrymen. My desire to come to America was great. I had saved $800 for passage. I visited my mother to tell her of my plans. My stepfather became angry at the news and ordered me from my ancestral home because I had joined the church. Firm in my belief, I turned to walk the long journey back to my apartment. As I was walking along, very cold and discouraged, I looked up and there was a man dressed in brown clothing walking along beside me. After some silence, the stranger called me by name, saying, "Peter, I want to tell you that you're doing the right thing by going to America. You will never regret it. You will be greatly blessed for the things that you are doing for yourself and for your children and your children's children. Don't worry about your mother. Later, you'll have a chance to help her. Remember to always be as you have been in your life, and your blessings will be great." I talked to the man about my plans to go to America and a few other things. We walked along for a little ways, and when I looked up to speak again, the man was gone. It was a level country, and I looked in every direction, but never saw him again. I believe the man was a heavenly visitor.
The $800 Peter had saved was much more than the cost of his passage, so he used the extra money to help other immigrants.
On November 24th, 1854, I boarded the steamer Cimbria at Frederickshaven. There were about 300 saints already on board.
My family and I also boarded the Cimbria. After I met Peter, I noticed he had his eye on a certain Anna Poulsen. We all got acquainted on the exact same journey from Frederikshavn, Denmark, to Mormon Grove, Kansas.
We had not traveled far on our journey when the wind turned southwest and began to blow so heavily that the captain found it necessary to find safe harbor. The Cimbria turned and put into the port of Mandal, Norway, an excellent natural harbor surrounded by very high and steep granite cliffs.
This romantic place was as much of a curiosity to us as a shipload of Mormons were to the people of Mandal. 2 weeks after leaving, the Cimbria again put to sea, but we soon learned that the change in the weather was only a lull preceding a violent winter storm.
Towards midnight, the wind became a terrific gale, which increased in velocity till it shattered the ship's bulwarks. and broke a number of boxes. The captain deemed it necessary to turn back again, this time clear back to Frederickshaven.
By this time, we were suffering severely. While we waited 11 days for the weather and wind to change in our favor, a number of meetings were held which made a good impression upon the people of the seaport town. It was almost Christmas before the weather moderated, and the captain made a third attempt to reach England. By this time, we were all rested and in good spirits.
But soon a worse storm than any of the preceding ones arose. For many hours the noble Cimbria fought her way against the raging elements, but for the third time we were turned back. While the captain and crew were worried, most of the saints continued cheerful and thanked the Lord for their preservation.
In the afternoon, the wind suddenly changed in our favor to the north. The captain immediately steered for Hull, England, once more amid the rejoicings of the saints.
The captain said, "I'm so glad I had some Mormons aboard, so this ship didn't go down." Finally, the ship was anchored safely. We continued our journey by rail from Hull to Liverpool on Christmas Day.
The presidency in Liverpool previously had chartered the ship Hellos to take the Scandinavian emigrants to New Orleans, but the Hellos had not waited through our delays caused by bad weather.
The three-masted square rigger, James Nesbeth, was secured for our passage to New Orleans. 441 sailed from Liverpool the first week of January. We arrived at the mouth of the Mississippi in mid-February. During the 6-week voyage, 13 people died. At New Orleans, many of us boarded the large steamboat Oceana and sailed from New Orleans the next day up the Mississippi towards St. Louis. On the journey up the Mississippi River, 7 more of the saints died. We arrived in St. Louis, Missouri in early March. 175 of the travelers left St. Louis in mid-March on the steamboat Clara for Atchison, Kansas. Due to low water in the river, we were compelled to land in Leavenworth, where an additional 20 of the immigrants died. After selecting a new camping place, cholera broke out and caused 9 more deaths.
In the latter part of May, the emigrants traveled to Mormon Grove, situated about 5 miles west of Atchison, Kansas, which had been selected as the outfitting point for all emigrants crossing the plains in 1855. Martha Clemenson and her family were able to continue the journey directly to the valley that summer. They left Mormon Grove in mid-June in Captain Jacob F. Sechrist's company.
Our wagons were quite heavily loaded. We all had to walk unless some of us were sick, in which case we would ride till we were better. When we camped for the night, we young folks would go and gather buffalo chips. All the pioneers who crossed the plains knew what they were. We had to cook our supper with the chips, as wood was very scarce in some places. Sometimes we met hungry Indians and shared our provisions, even if we could not spare them. We passed an immense herd of buffalo and could feel the ground tremble for quite a distance. Our oxen became so excited that they ran away, but not one of us was injured. One of the men killed a buffalo, which provided us with fresh meat for a while. We waded all the rivers we crossed until reaching Green River, which was so swift and deep that we had to cross in wagons, and the swift water almost took the oxen off their feet.
Sometime after arriving in America, Martha's mother died of malnutrition and the dreadful disease of cholera. This was heart-wrenching to the family because they knew how much their mother had wanted to reach Zion.
The Sechrist wagon train arrived in Salt Lake City, September 7th, 1855.
Martha and her siblings stayed for a year in Salt Lake City. She got a job working for Apostle Lorenzo Snow in his home to earn board and room. They appreciated her, and she often said how she loved to live in a home where they were so kind.
Many Danish people were going to Sanpete County to live, including my brother and sister, so I decided to go too.
A few months after reaching Kansas, Peter became engaged to Anna Polson, whom he had first met on board the Cimbria. The young couple had waited a year after their arrival from Denmark for their turn in making the long journey across the plains. They were married just a short time before they joined the company of Bishop Abraham O. Smoot. When the Abraham Owen Smoot Company left Mormon Grove, Kansas territory, August 10, 1856, there were more wagons than drivers. 6 of the wagons belonged to Smoot, and there were wagons belonging to B.H. Young, Erastus Snow, Heber C. Kimball, and John Taylor. Peter was one of the men strong enough to handle this type of work. He drove a heavy wagon the entire way. At the Little Muddy Fork of the Grasshopper, the train added more wagons, all bearing heavy equipment such as a steamboat boiler and a thresher. Pushing onward, the train reached the Big Blue. Freight stored the previous year was then loaded into 3 empty wagons. All the wagons were overloaded, and the teams would be overworked, causing serious delays. By now, with the added heavy cargo and the additional travelers, the newlyweds were sharing their wagon and all they had with 5 others. While crossing the mountains, the group suffered extreme cold and overexertion and stopped for a rest. Tragedy struck when the company was afflicted with cholera. 4 of the 7 in Peter's wagon died. Sadly, Anna Polson Isaacson, Peter's bride of 3 months, was among the casualties. After almost a month of struggle, the travelers reached Fort Kearny, where they learned that Cheyenne Indians had attacked and killed Almon W. Babbitt, Territorial Secretary for Utah, and others who had been traveling just ahead. The next day, the company passed the Willie handcart train that was north of the Platte River. The Smoot wagon train was on the south side. They discovered the remains of 3 California-bound travelers. Again, this appeared to be the work of the Cheyenne. Soon, Smoot's men had to double-team their wagons to get over some sand ridges. They were short on drivers, as so few men were fit for duty. In mid-September, they found more evidence the Cheyenne had attacked again. Consequently, Captain Smoot increased their rate of travel. At the end of the month, they met Apostle Parley P. Pratt, traveling with a group of outward-bound missionaries near Horseshoe Creek. This turned out to be Elder Pratt's last journey. He was murdered the next year as he was returning to the West. By October 9th, the heavily loaded train was at 3 crossings on the Sweetwater. Provisions were running low, so Captain Smoot left the train and forged ahead, seeking relief. The wagons crossed Rocky Ridge, reached South Pass 2 days later, and arrived at Little Sandy in mid-October. Captain Smoot met them at Little Sandy in mid-October with news that the fresh relief train was waiting at Big Sandy. From the relief wagons, the travelers secured much-needed beef, flour, and vegetables, plus 19 men, several span of horses and mules, and 6 wagons. When they arrived at Fort Bridger, it had been snowing hard for 2 days, and the temperature had dropped to 0. They were forced to leave 100 head of cattle and much freight. October 27th, the women and children boarded some horse-drawn wagons and sprinted towards Salt Lake, arriving in the city 6 days later. With 8 wagons and a little freight, the men left Fort Bridger on October 30th. Snow fell at the end of the next week. Nevertheless, the train moved slowly forward, reaching the eastern slope of Big Mountain before camping. The air was bitterly cold. By double teaming, the men got their wagons to the summit, where the snow was 2 feet deep. As the wagons descended the slippery slope, 2 of them overturned, but were soon recovered and repaired. They stopped at Willow Springs in Emigration Canyon before entering Salt Lake City on November 9th, just weeks ahead of the Willie Handcart Company. Peter stayed in Salt Lake City a short time before moving on to San Pete County. After Martha arrived in San Pete, she met Peter Isaacson again. They remembered they had traveled to America on the same ships. Peter asked Martha,
Are you married yet?
No, are you?
No, I'm waiting for you.
Martha and Peter were married in Salt Lake City, April 21st, 1857. They received their endowments and were sealed in the endowment house on November 15th, 1861. 3 months after Peter and Martha were married, Peter was one of 2,500 men who went to Echo Canyon to check the approach of Johnston's army. Fort Ephraim, built by the Saints as a protection against the Indians, was home to Peter and Martha from 1858 to 1876. All 4 of their children were born in Ephraim. Peter, who died when just a little boy, Isaac, Maria, and Martin. When Martha went into labor for the birth of her youngest child, Peter had taken 7-year-old Ike to look for 2 milk cows they were afraid had been driven off by the Indians. When she could wait for Peter no longer, she called 4-year-old Maria to her bedside.
Do you think you could go to the neighbors and ask Sister Scholes to come and help me?
Yes, Mama.
Mariah was too young to understand what was happening, but she knew her mother was very sick and wrapped her shawl over her head and shoulders and went for help. The little girl hurried. She was worried about her mother. She looked up and down the street to see if any horses or wagons were coming. Though fearful, she started to cross, but the wet road was too slippery and she fell repeatedly. Even though she feared being run over, she got down and crawled all the way across the road. When she could, she got up and ran the rest of the way to the Scholes. Soon Sister Scholes and Maria returned to Martha's bedside. The little girl was warmed up, reassured, and soon asleep in her soft feather bed. In the morning, her father and Brother Ike were home, and the brave little messenger saw her baby brother Martin for the first time.
Several years after the Isaacsons arrived in Ephraim, a plague of grasshoppers came to the valley. The insects were so numerous that they obscured the sun. Everyone in the town joined in the battle. The men built trenches around the fields and filled them with straw, and then they formed a line and drove the grasshoppers into the straw-filled trenches, which they would quickly set on fire. In this way, they were able to save some of their grain. But Peter had a big flock of chickens, which he turned loose on their fields. The chickens ate a few of the grasshoppers, but in the end, Martha and Peter both felt that it was the chickens that had saved their grain.
Peter raised plentiful gardens. He raised so many peas that they harvested them with the thresher and used them for cow and pig feed. His potatoes were another good crop. He stored them well and kept them in a deep pit. In the spring of 1865, the Saints had to organize in war against the Black Hawk Indians. Lacking government assistance, the men trained themselves and furnished their own ammunition. Peter served as a captain over the Silver Gray. a troop of 50 men. The Indians were sly and clever, attacking most often those working alone and unprotected. A band of Indians killed neighbors working in the field just a block from the Isaacson home. For safety, the men would travel together to the mountains above Ephraim for the winter's wood supply. They would work all day and return home before nightfall. One day, Ike begged his father to let him go for wood, but Peter decided not to take his young son. As the men worked cutting wood, they suddenly realized that they were surrounded by Indians, armed with bows, arrows, and some guns. Peter heard shots, then a bullet whizzed by his head. He jumped back and saw an Indian dodge behind a tree. A person Peter felt was a heavenly messenger appeared to Peter and advised him to run the opposite way from the wagons and travel indirectly towards home, which he did. The Indians had blocked the road, and many who ran for their wagons in town had been killed. A few men hid in the underbrush and escaped the next day. Before Peter reached home, he'd run so fast his feet were sore and aching, and he finally took his shoes off to keep walking. Upon reaching home, he almost fainted from exhaustion. Peter was always thankful he hadn't given in to little Ike's coaxing. He couldn't have carried the boy and run fast enough, and certainly couldn't have left his little son behind.
News of the attack frightened Martha so she lost the baby she was carrying.
Peter worked hard on a fine rock house for his family and almost had it finished when he was called to Arizona as a leader in helping the saints colonize there. In February 1876, Peter left for what was to be known as Brigham City, a United Order settlement on the Little Colorado River. The small company he traveled with moved without trouble until they encountered snow 4 feet deep on Buckskin Mountain. The teams from the other wagons, 8 mules in all, were used on one wagon at a time. The cold was severe. Next came the mud from the melting snow, but finally they reached dry roads. They crossed the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry and traveled up Lee's Backbone, a horrifying, steep, craggy, solid rock right near the edge of the river. Soon after they arrived, work began. A site was selected, crops were planted, and the fort was gradually constructed. Due to failure of the first crops, Peter made a round trip to Utah for a load of grain from his own storage bin in Ephraim to feed the people of Brigham City. He felt extra responsibility as superintendent of all the farms and as first counselor in the bishopric. 2 years later, after the fort was built and the camp was prepared, Peter returned to Ephraim to bring his wife and children back with him to Arizona. 6 crossings of Lee's Backbone for Peter within 2 years. Martha hated to leave her brother and sister in Ephraim, but she knew that they must answer the call of the leaders of the church. She drove a team and wagon most of the way.
Life at the new fort in Arizona was very different for Martha. She adjusted and took her turns with the tasks of the fort. As usual, she was never idle. All her spare time was spent carding, spinning, and knitting wool. She made all her family stockings. She also carded wool for batting. She loved to work with quilts because they were something new. She had never seen any in the old country, as she would say. One quilt Martha made was pieced completely from the legs of old hand-knitted socks, which she cut up after the feet were worn out. Her quilts were always stitched by hand until the family got a machine in Arizona to sew with. To Martha, that machine was as wonderful as the reaper and binder. She was so pleased when she learned how to run it.
The saints worked tirelessly, but they did not succeed in building a permanent dam there on the Little Colorado River. Without enough water, Brigham City was eventually abandoned. In the fall, about 5 years after they had come to Arizona from Ephraim, the Isaacsons moved north of St. John's, Arizona, to settle the Meadows. Other families joined with them, and Peter led his small band of saints, serving as their bishop. Only part of the settlers were active members. This, along with the desolate circumstances and lack of buildings, provided challenges which would have discouraged most men. The families banded together to survive. After they'd cleared the greasewood from the land, they fenced the boundaries and divided the lots. Logs were hauled from the mountains, and one by one, houses were built for each family. Some with 2 rooms, some with just 1. The first winter at the Meadows was a real hardship. The people and the cattle almost starved to death. Peter's family was more fortunate than the others because they wouldn't kill their cow to eat as many had done, and as a result, there was milk and butter to nourish them through. It was inspiring to watch Peter preparing the grain seed for planting. He would open the sack and then on bended knees bless the seed that it might grow and mature for his good and the blessings of those in need. When spring came, the gardens were planted, and when harvested, all the families enjoyed corn, squash, and beans. The settlers fenced in big fields of wild hay. Their herds of cattle increased, and the families enjoyed feasting on the good meat.
Martha made butter and sold it along with her eggs and milk, buttermilk, and Dutch cheese. She knew and loved each hen and chick. She never wasted one feather. Even when a chick died, she would save the feathers for bedding and pillows. An old custom, which Martha never gave up, was that of gleaning the grain from the fields after the harvesters were through. Her sack of wheat that Peter prayed over was gleaned in Brigham City, practically the only grain they had to plant the first year at the Meadows.
One set of neighbors often borrowed from the Isaacsons. Martha fretted over this because they neglected to repay. They would borrow flour, molasses, and fresh meat if available. Over time, they had borrowed a lot of meat, explaining they were planning to repay what they had borrowed when they sold their only cow. Instead, when the cow was sold, they bought finery and luxuries. After a visit where the neighbors showed off their pretty things, Martha fretted. She felt they were foolish for using the money from their only cow to buy finery, and they were rascals for not paying back the meat they had borrowed. The foolish neighbors provoked more trouble when they came over asking again to borrow enough meat and flour for supper. Martha demanded to know why they had not thought of food until all their money was gone. A stormy exchange followed.
Finally, Peter stood up, gave his neighbors flour for a meal from his meager supply, and sent them on their way. After they had left, he told his wife and children,
Be thankful for being blessed with more sense. It is wrong to criticize people not blessed with good judgment.
The family continued to build security and live well using good sense. They enjoyed delicious foods made from the ingredients produced entirely on their farm, like Martha's chicken soup with Danish dumplings.
Martha and Peter's oldest son, Ike, married Elsina Peterson. They had 11 children and permanently settled in St. John's, Arizona. Peter and Martha's youngest son, Martin, married Mary Jemina Beal, and they had 8 children. They lived in Ephraim, Utah. Mariah married Edwin Marion Whiting and eventually moved back to Utah, where most of their 9 children were born. Martha was so lonesome for her only daughter that she pleaded with her husband to take her home to Ephraim. Peter moved his wife back to Utah, but he returned to Arizona to finish his calling as bishop.
Martha loved her grandchildren, taught them poems and how to count to 10 in Danish, and treated them to tiny hotcakes fresh off the griddle.
After 2 more years, church leaders came to Peter and told him his work was complete and his place was with his wife. After 16 years of service in Arizona, Peter made the trip back to rejoin Martha and to finish the rock home he had started 20 years before.
Soon after Peter returned to Utah, the Isaacsons' 6-year-old grandson, Eddie Whiting, was stricken with typhoid fever in Mapleton. There was quite an epidemic of it at the time. The nurses and midwives of the day believed that the only way to cure typhoid was to withhold water from the patient and let the fever burn out. They believed that water, even if applied to the face with a damp cloth, fed the fever. Eddie got so thirsty he begged and begged for water. When his Whiting cousin, who they felt was in better condition, died, it seemed there was little or no chance for Eddie. Mariah and Edwin knew her father had a gift for healing and sent a letter to Ephraim. They figured that if Peter started immediately, he could be there in 2 or 3 days, some 80 miles by team and wagon. Eddie pleaded continuously for water. Finally, Peter arrived. Mariah exclaimed,
Hurry, Father, or it'll be too late.
Peter told her he must have time to get in touch with the Lord. He asked for a basin of water to wash his hands. He sat by Eddie, putting his cold hand on the child's head and talking quietly to the frightened parents. He told Edwin to give Eddie a spoonful of water. Edwin wept as he hurried to give the child the water, saying he thought it would help, that he had never thought water would hurt anyhow. Then the great moment came when the father and an uncle joined Peter in giving a priesthood blessing. Peter spoke in a quiet, matter-of-fact way to the Lord. It seemed like he was talking right to him. It was a long prayer, spoken with firmness and faith. Young Eddie slept through the night, and by the next evening, the fever was gone.
As a doctor, I can explain this old belief, which even some doctors held in that era. One of the complications of typhoid fever is perforation of the bowel. When that occurs, everything by mouth increases the infection. No doubt these old-time nurses observed this and acted accordingly. Now we know that a much worse enemy is dehydration, and we give large quantities of water by mouth unless there are signs of perforation. Then we switch to intravenous fluids. Ronald Brown, MD.
Peter Isaacson was a well-read and learned man. He had the gift of remembering everything that he read. He loved the gospel, and his faith was broadened because of his efforts. At least on 2 occasions, he was guided by heavenly messengers. This picture was taken during sacrament meeting at the Ephraim Tabernacle of Peter with both arms raised in the old manner, offering the sacramental prayer.
The morning of his death in June 1920, he left peacefully at the age of 92. Every kin of Peter Isaacson can well be proud of the worthy and good heritage he left.
Martha was a very intelligent and wise woman, and even though she never had a chance to learn to read or write in English, she'd always kept accurate records of her dealings, especially when she was selling her eggs or dairy products or her fruit. She learned early in life that she had to earn her bread by the sweat of her brow, and she did that all of her life. She had no chance for education, but she insisted that her children all learn to read and write. Martha was a woman who knew many hardships and sorrows. She came to America, and she witnessed the passing of her mother on the trail for lack of food. Martha was always grateful for her chance to join the church. She was grateful for her husband, and she was grateful for the family with which she had been blessed. Martha was a hard worker, and as she worked, she saved. She gleaned grain, she tended her cows and chickens, and she sold eggs and butter and cheese and milk. She taught her children to be frugal and to glean. And once, while gleaning with her daughter, Maria reminded her mother of the words of Brigham Young, who had once said that a bushel of wheat could be worth more than a bushel of gold. And to that Martha replied,
If I could have had a bushel of wheat to keep my mother from starving to death, don't you think it would have been worth more than a bushel of gold?
Martha died on the 13th of December, 1913, at the age of 92, leaving to her posterity her example, her ideals, her hopes, and her savings in Zion's Savings Bank.
As for our posterity, several became leaders in our church.
Many have served as missionaries, bishops, stake presidents, and mission presidents. There are many mothers raising fine families and fathers who support and provide.
Our perseverance in earning a good living has been passed on too.
The values of hard work, willing service, and deep faith have continued to be passed abundantly through each of the generations. Our posterity now number more than 6,000.
This valiant couple, Peter and Martha Isaacson, were willing to sacrifice, work hard, and live exemplary lives. They left us a priceless legacy.